Here we are again. I'm back with you folks talking about psychoactive drug plants used traditionally in various parts of the world. Some would argue that this is almost a pan-global phenomena in traditional societies, and that would be ancient societies, even to modern times, but within societies that are not affected by some of the major monotheistic religions or by modern industrial economies. The use of these special plants to communicate with the ancestors, a way of providing a continuum between one generation and another generation. Certain plants that are able to alter consciousness have been used for thousands of years, perhaps way back before the beginning of agriculture, as we talked about earlier, to Paleolithic or pre-farming days. And we're connected with that first professional, the shaman, or the individual who was a repository of information, first dramatist, the first doctor, who told us stories that united and reinforced the cultural values, the cultural history, the culture of individual societies around the world, from Siberia in the boreal forest down through the tropical temperate rainforest to the desert areas to the tropical dry and wet areas throughout the world. The greatest numbers of examples are in the more remote areas, especially in the New World, in parts of the Amazon and also in very remote areas, in particular in Mexico. But there is evidence from various places, and it even ties plants that we often associate with both legal and illegal relationships in modern societies, such as the use of things like coca, as we'll see in the New World, which had religious connotations and connections between the afterworld or the spirit world in modern societies, to plants like the opium poppy, which of course is an extremely important drug plant for pain relief as well as for used illicitly for pleasure, but is highly addictive and can be very dangerous. Many of these plants had their connections, and in some cases still do, among traditional peoples. The names of these plants, and we didn't get into this earlier, classified according to sometimes what is believed to be their specific or certainly their main effect on the brain. For instance, stimulants, such as those plants that are used to stimulate the brain and often the body, things that contain caffeine, such as coffee and tea, and the cola nut from cola drinks. And there are many other species that contain caffeine that are traditionally used, like the yerba mate, which is drunk in the southern South America over a large area. These plants contain caffeine, and those are stimulants, like the alkaloid cocaine in the coca leaf. Other plants known as narcotics, but the true narcotics are those that induce sleep, like the kava plant, the traditional plant of the gods in parts of the Pacific, especially remote Oceania, such as traditionally and still in some places in Polynesia, and traditionally in some places in Melanesia, and a few places even in Micronesia, where kava has, or still is, a very important psychoactive plant as a plant of the gods. It also may be used recreationally. Another true narcotic, of course, is the opium poppy, and it can induce sleep and has been used for that purposes. Other plants called narcotics would be a misnomer, essentially. It's often used in association with illegal plants that are used as drug plants or have mind-altering purposes. But technically, narcotics induce narcosis or sleep. You have another group of plants called hallucinogens. That also is somewhat, some would say, demeaning from a traditional cultural use point of view, and certainly not complete. There are plants called hallucinogens that may not produce hallucinations, which are false sensory perception. from a point of view of our own empiricism or sensory apparatus. But the so-called hallucinogens create profound changes in consciousness and altering the brain. And these are perhaps the most important, or many of these have served societies as a way of getting out-of-body experiences, breaking open the mind. The word ecstasy, which of course is referred to a artificially produced substance in modern recreational use, but ecstasy comes from the Greek word origin of ecstasis, which essentially means the separation of the mind and the body, and breaking free to enter another level of consciousness. That's what ecstasy was essentially meant to be, and that's really what the plants of the gods, to break out of our normal consciousness and be able to communicate with the spirit world from the perception, the cognitive perception of the people who use these substances. Some very strong hallucinogens, for instance, the Banisteriopsis vine in conjunction with other plant substances to induce visionary experiences, and this vision quest is produced by a number of plants and also some fungi. In particular, the most famous perhaps would be Peyote, which is used traditionally in Mexico, and then within the last 150 years or so up into North America, especially among Native Americans, for a vision quest to understand one's life and one's reality and to communicate with the ancestors or spirit world. So I would like to mention that among those other classifications of plants, there is a classification that some anthropologists, cultural historians, and those sensitive to the importance of these traditionally used plants for communication with ancestors or communicating with the spirit world, they like to refer to those plants not as hallucinogens, but as entheogens. Entheogen. En referring to the inward or from inside, theo, God, and gen from like generate. So entheogen is a plant that generates the God within to bring out the connection that one can have through the use of these drug plants. Of course, yoga, meditation, satori's, and other religions can unite the individual with the spirit world. So that use of the plant is less demeaning when these plants are used not for recreation, not for a mundane, a secular use, but for a direct perception of the afterworld, the spirit world, or the ancestors. So given that we've been discussing plants that may have been entheogens, some of them normally called stimulants or narcotics or hallucinogens, we're focusing on the entheogens, those plants that can generate a connection to the individual with the spirit world. A couple others that I'd like to just refer to you from the old world. One, and when I say old world, for those that don't know, that this is from a Western perspective and include Eurasia and Africa. And Eurasia would include not only Europe and what we think of as Asia, from Central Asia to East Asia, including China and Mongolia and Korea and Japan, for example, and the eastern part of what's now Russia. But South Asia, including, of course, the Himalayan countries, Nepal and Bhutan, but also India, of course, and Pakistan, and the Near East, and the Southeast Asia. One plant, just an example, in Africa, where we don't know a lot about some of the plants, which may have disappeared over time, as monotheism, Christianity, Islam, spread through these areas and put down the traditionals' perceptions as pagan beliefs, and in fact either persecuted or in other ways dismissed and put pressure to forget about and to abolish the use of these plants because they were associated with what was called more primitive, almost savage religious beliefs. But in some places, in particular part of West Africa, there's an area where the use of a plant related to plumeria in the Passanesi, this is Iboga tabernanthe, which is a shrub, and this plant has been used and associated with traditional religion there, and in this area they've been able, through to a large degree the use of this plant in their traditional beliefs to not be overtaken by either Christianity or Islam. And the use of this plant, the root of it, the iboga plant, when prepared and ingested, produces very strong hallucinations. And one of the most interesting of their connections of its uses is in a rite of passage of young men, sometimes young women, or women are given this as well, but young men to go to the level of adulthood take relatively large doses of this particular substance. This is the one and only so-called hallucinogen or entheogen that we know of that can kill in large doses. In small doses, it's a stimulant and used for people to stay up all night if they're guarding or hunting. But in relatively large doses, the description from the people themselves and what they want to achieve is a breaking free of the mind and to visit with the ancestors and have a vision of essentially the skeletal format of their ancestors who can communicate with them. And in the process of this particular experience, they are told the moral values of their society, how to behave and what not to do, and the reality of their life, what's come before that, what goes on now, and what will happen in the future. A connection from their culture and their the generations to come, the generations that are here now, and the generations to past, speaking with the ancestors. And this is a classic case of a plant of the god being used here, an African or West African example, with a plant in Apasanesi, the iboga tabernan. A plant which is basically a stimulant that has an alkaloid, not caffeine, but another alkaloid that stimulates the central nervous system and creates a sense of alertness and well-being. It comes from chewing on a leaf, not the coca leaf, but the leaf of a tree called Khat edulis. And this tree, producing a leaf which contains this cathadine alkaloid, has become a traditional use in from East Africa into parts of the Arabian Peninsula. And the plant is a leaf that's used is known as Khat, as well as the tree, the Khat tree. And Khat is highly desirable, and as coca leaves are chewed by, say, Andean Native Americans, the Khat is chewed by native peoples in parts of East Africa, and very commonly in parts of, say, the area known as Yemen or the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. And this is often today used as a secular use, such as in Southeast Asia, the use of the betel nut, fruit of a palm, to chew, and people like to do this all day long. It becomes a very strong cultural use. Some of its association is forgotten about, the association with the spirit world, because in modern societies it becomes a commercial product, and in urban societies people becomes peer group pressure and other things. So it is used basically like coffee is used in our society to develop a sense of well-being, and perhaps some would argue a work ethic, or at least to stay alert. But just like in coca, the Khat can have a series of socially important uses and associations with what could be considered religious activity. Now what I'd like to do is move on to the New World, where there's many plants that have been identified and studied in over the last 100 years, 150 years, and especially in more modern times, and there may still be other plants out there that we don't know about in remote societies where careful study is needed to identify these species and their particular use. So let me first talk about if we move from, say, North America and parts of the arid areas of North America down through Mexico and then down into South America, with just some examples. There were archaeological finds along the Rio Grande River. These findings, starting in the 1970s, archaeological digs reported this kind of a sequence in the excavations. In the lower parts, just above what we would call a sterile horizon, where there is no materials that associate with humans, in other words, where human occupation of this particular site began. Among the other paleobotanical or fossil or subfossil materials found that have been buried and preserved in the archaeological site. Among those were the red beans, seeds of a plant in the bean family, Fabaceae. And these are known as Sophora secundiflora, or known often as the mescal bean. These have cysteine, a relatively strong and potentially lethal alkaloid if consumed by humans or other mammals. This red bean cult was known to have been used, and it's assumed that this cult began with the use of this bean plant that's native to the area, and in some way preparing these seeds that were possibly used for a rite of passage or a way to communicate the gods if people, the shaman, were able to determine the appropriate dose would alter consciousness but not end consciousness for an individual. But a very dangerous plant to use. Higher up in the sequence of archaeological excavation, higher up meaning a little bit younger, the principle of superposition. The oldest layer that hasn't been disturbed would be the oldest, or the lowest layer would be the oldest. And then the mid-level, a little bit younger, and the upper levels, youngest in the sequence. This mid-level had another species of plant which is known to have potential to alter consciousness, but it also has some dangerous aspects in terms of dosage, but not as dangerous as the mescal bean. Then up at the upper levels were found evidence of peyote. Peyote is a cactus in the cactus family. I mentioned it as a fungi before. That was a mistake. It's a cactus in the flowering plant group of angiosperms, and adapted to dry environments. Its native range, by the way, would just reach over into the what's now the United States and the southern borders, say, of Texas along the Rio Grande. Its natural range, all the way down into primarily its majority of its range through the Chihuahuan Desert in the saddle or the upper Meseta Central between the Sierra Occidental and Sierra Oriental mountain ranges of the greater Mexican country. The Lophophora williamsii, this is the major species of peyote, is a carrot-like looking cactus, though not related to carrots. Most of it's the overall plant is in the root. It has a small cap-like structure above ground with ribbed, fleshy, small, perhaps a couple of inches across in diameter, and it has tufts of hair on the top, and in fact its scientific name is named after this tuft cap. In any case, the upper above ground part is cut. It grows in groups of these, often alone, open in the desert, or under other plants in this desert arid environment. It contains up to 30 alkaloids, of which by far the most famous is mescaline, which is known to open the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley referred to in his book, The Doors of Perception, which related his quote-unquote adventure or experience ingesting this back in the late 50s. But Native Americans, such as the Tarahumara and the Huichol Native Americans, have used this for perhaps thousands of years. And the archaeology near the Rio Grande River, dating back to the 1970s, showed that these, at least some thousands of years ago, peyote was being used then, as it still is now, in a quest to find one's life, to connect oneself with the natural world and the supernatural world by ingesting the peyote. And the influence of not just mescaline, but all of the other alkaloids as kind of synergistic effect with the right, as we talked about earlier. Any drug experience is a combination of the individual psychological set or condition, the setting within which the drug or the psychoactive substance, the entheogen, is ingested, and of course the drug itself. The quality in terms of the psychoactive substances, most often alkaloidal, and the quantity of these. So those three things together will more or less explain the individual experience of that person, whether it be a shaman, the shaman's patient, or an individual going through a rite of passage, or a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And so this New World evidence from the dry environment tells us that plants have been found in dryland environments. Central Asia, the ephedra plant, that's in the Old World, which was a stimulant but used for probably as a plant of the god, to the New World, where a desert, arid environment, plants such as this cactus, the peyote, has been used for thousands of years for vision quests or as an entheogen. So I'm kind of relating here geography, biogeography, that we see humans, wherever they moved and migrated, as we spread out over the world. A theory is that we were culturally programmed from the earliest days of our developing in a society and a shaman individual with repository of information about the society. And as we migrated beyond into new ecosystems, new environmental conditions, we may have lost the opportunity to use that plant that had been traditionally used, and culturally programmed to, in our search for plants that could be eaten, used for medicine or fiber or various things, we also were able to find and identify those plants that could transport us as human beings in that society into the spirit world. So let's finish up here with a few other examples from the New World. A classic example, which is of course highly controversial in terms of its modern connection, that is the coca plant. The coca plant, Eroxylon coca or Eroxylon novagranatense, a couple of species, a shrub to small tree that is native to South America, northern South America, and the mid-levels of the Andean mountains in particular. And the leaves of this plant have alkaloids in them. The most important is the alkaloid of cocaine. We often associate drug plants with the drug that is used. There's a big difference of separating out the alkaloid from the overall plant itself, and not just in terms of the overall effect, but the overall cultural context within which it's used. The now world-famous natural-oriented doctor, Dr. Andrew Weil, a Harvard graduate who worked with the famous, or was a student under the famous Richard Evans Schultes, the father of modern ethnobotany from Harvard, the late Dr. Schultes. Dr. Weil pointed out in a very important article the difference between the green and the white. Essentially, when you chew coca leaves, it's much different than when you are ingesting the extracted cocaine. And the same thing would even be with use of opium versus extracting and just using the alkaloid of morphine. Now, from a doctor's point of view or physician's point of view, knowing what the alkaloid is very important, because then you can control dose. You know exactly what the alkaloid is. Often in the labs they may construct an artificial copy of that molecule, which can then be even further controlled in the sense you don't have to grow it in fields which could be ripped off or get into illegal markets if it is a substance that you need to monitor for a variety of reasons. In any case, the traditional use of plants is not to extract often just that alkaloid, but is in context of the plant itself, which is often revered as being having a divine aspect, as in the coca plant. Coming back to Eroxylon coca, its association with mama coca, association with the culture, the life during and after of societies. A very, very important, actually sacred plant among the traditional peoples who may chew it every day and it's part of their adaptation to the hard work they may have to do climbing up and down the Andean mountains, but also the nutrient value of the leaf itself. It actually provides for a relatively poor people in the Andes nutrients and some minerals, so the nutritional value overall of the leaf has to be considered, along with the stimulating effects and its association with a gift of the gods, a plant of the gods. Coca's association goes way, way back from artifacts we found of its use traditionally by South American, many different tribal groups. And so we shouldn't think when in discussing or thinking about plants of the gods, the modern recreational, often peer group or commercially inspired or directed use of plants that in some cases have become highly illegal and highly controversial. And all of these plants in their particular context could be seen as not only possibly beneficial, but sacred and therefore very important in the cultural context of their original or traditional uses. Some other plants besides, we mentioned the peyote cactus. It actually has other relatives that in the cactus family who produce many alkaloids. The cactus, that's probably these alkaloids in their origin are in many cases for defense mechanism against insects or herbivores that might eat the plants. The peyote is a small cactus. In South America, in parts of Peru again, generally in the semi-dry or semi-arid areas up into the mountains, there's a tall columnar cactus that can grow to twice or more the height of a normal human being. And these tall cactus, with their modern Spanish name of San Pedro cactus, they're Trichoceros pachanoi, have been traditionally used, sections cut off of the succulent branching parts of this large cactus and sliced up and used and still are by shaman in various parts of South America, in parts of Chile, in parts of certainly Peru, all the way up into Ecuador for therapeutic, shamanistic uses and within religious contexts, and cleansing emotionally, spiritually, to get rid of illnesses that may be based upon spiritual dysfunctionality or an emotional dysfunctionality, as well as strictly physical problems. A couple other examples of plants of the gods. One that you might not think about, one that's legal and is probably the most dangerous plant on earth, and that in terms of numbers of people who are incapacitated and die from the use of this, in some cases slow death, like a very close relative of mine, and that is tobacco. Tobacco was first seen by Columbus and his group. They thought people were drinking smoke. Tobacco was perhaps one of the most widespread plants, along with corn and a few other domesticated, cultivated plants in the New World, which we associate with North America and South America. And the New World, again, is a Western perspective of a new discovery after, from their point of view, Columbus. But that was in 1492 AD, and we think that people arrived in North America and spread relatively fast all the way throughout South America, except for very harsh environments, and even in some harsh environments, 10,000 years or more ago. And as they moved theoretically across the Aleutian or Bering Strait land bridge back 10,000 or more years ago at the end of the Ice Age, they brought with them the use probably of Amanita muscaria mushroom of the Siberian groups that still use it today, and the use traditionally, which is coming back after the drop of the Soviet Union, who put down the use of these fungi. And we now have evidence that tribal groups, as the humans spread into, say, what's now Alaska, especially Canada, all the way across to the eastern Canada, in the boreal forests, where they could find under pine trees and in the open areas under birch trees in particular, these Amanita red-capped muscaria mushrooms, and that these were used to communicate with the ancestors. And we have tribal information from, say, northern Michigan to eastern Canada, as well as all the way back to Siberia for that. But then as people moved out of the, down through North America from the boreal forests into the temperate wet forests, or the broadleaf forests of northeastern U.S., they had to discover other plants. We're coming back to tobacco. And as they moved down through into the deserts of, say, the Basin and Range region of western United States, the high deserts, and then into the coastal wet forests of, say, northern of Washington, western Washington, Oregon, and California. When they moved into the Mediterranean climates, they found different plants that they could use, such as the Datura species, now often referred to as like Jimson weeds, that were used by coastal Californians down in the Mediterranean region of Southern California, or other closely related Datura species by the Zunis, and then moved down into the desert and found peyote, culturally programmed as they moved into new areas where they couldn't find their old plants of the gods. They found others. This is a theoretical explanation for this widespread cultural use, as hunters and gatherers spread over the world and then still use these as they became farmers until the sweep of monotheism in modern, relatively more recent historical times, spreading all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. Different plants were used. And in the Amazon, with its great biological diversity, many plants were found, such as lianas that produce, such as yahe, sometimes known as ka'ape, or ayahuasca, which some of you have heard about and are still used by shamans today, sometimes by pseudo-shamans for tourists who want to come and have a psychoactive spirit experience. But in its traditional sense, these were plants of the gods, which were used for therapeutic, spiritual healing, for spiritual identification with the ancestors and the things we've been talking about as true entheogens. Other plants were used, trees in particular, for resins, such as the Virola species, in the preparation of resin or bark scrapings that were boiled down and dried out and then pulverized, that could be used to blow into the nose through hollowed out bird bones as a kind of snuff, with having psychoactive substances such as harmaline and other very potent alkaloids that alter consciousness and perception and create kinds of visions. And these kinds of visions and perceptions, by the way, are inherent in the substances, but are directed culturally by the shaman to fit with the cultural values and history, and are affected by creating a particular set, individual psychological condition that the initiate, the person, the shaman himself, or the sick individual, or the person going through a rite of passage, to make them, through fasting, through various preparations in their life, short-term and long-term, to be ready to take this substance, because they would be communicating with their ancestors, and then to take this substance in the right setting. Often the setting could be in darkness or in a sensory deprivation environment where they would not have stimuli from their own senses of light, sensing, and hearing, but in a quiet, dark environment where the inner change, the entheogen, the God within, or the association, could be made between the individual and the spirit world more effectively. So that setting and the substances used really help define the actual entheogen and how it fit into individual cultures. And there are many other examples from the New World, but what I think I'd like to do now is give you one other way in which scientists, interest, or scholars, and both sometimes working together and with cultural historians, and trying to see that this is not only seen in some places today, this is an ancient trait, and we can even see it in some of the more famous ancient civilizations today. Let me give you an example. In ancient Greece, there was a traditional, looked at from say a Christian point of view as a cult, but basically it was just another point of view of how to interpret reality and afterlife. And this cult or religious system was called the Eleusinian Mysteries. There are many mystery cults in ancient history, let's say just in the Western society. But this Eleusinian mystery was interesting because we know that it lasted for 2,000 years, starting about 1,500 years before the birth of Christ, about the time that the Greek society, the Hellenistic societies were developing in the Greek mainland and eventually onto the Greek islands or archipelagos. And this was centered at a town called Ulysses, which was about 10 to 13 miles, if you will, from Athens. Every individual for 2,000 years in the realm of the Greek civilization. And when the Romans took over and essentially controlled Greece and well beyond to the west and east of the Italian peninsula, even the Romans, including the emperors, would make a migration to this town, Ulysses, to experience an entheogen, most likely. In this Eleusinian mysteries, people would come to Athens, whether it was the individual, a baker, or farmer, or even emperor, such as Marcus Aurelius, who wrote his own history. And we know in the written record that he went to, once in your lifetime, an individual would be humbled and realize whether he was emperor or a farmer, a peasant or a king. All of that earthly standard was not important. He or she was going to be introduced to the great mystery of life and death. And the individual would go to Athens, would have to spend some time there fasting, making certain ceremonial offerings, and then would have to walk from Athens to Eleusis. And there in the town of Eleusis, he would go into a subterranean chamber. In this case, this probably eventually evolved into an elaborate ceremony with priests, so it became more stratified and not just a shaman. And there in this underground sensory deprivation chamber, essentially, where light could be introduced periodically, beams of light, but mainly a darkened environment, the presentation of sacred information occurred. Now, every individual that went through this was required not to tell what went on, at the penalty of death. So it was a very serious thing that could not be the mysteries, and why they remain called the mysteries, because individuals should not reveal them. I think there is very, very strong possibility that would involve a psychoactive plant substance or fungi substance in the sacred drink in which people were revealed through a psychoactive experience directed in the preparation of fasting and what you believe would happen, and then in this extraordinary sensory deprivation setting with that substance under the direction. This was the early, actually beginning of Greek drama and theater, this presentation of life after death. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and remember that when we think of psychoactive drugs, we want to think, in the case of entheogens, of plants that are of traditional use and therefore have great value to those societies. They use them under strict use, not for pleasure in the sense of a recreational time to escape from what we would call reality, but rather to reaffirm their culture and their cultural traditions. Thank you very much.